HOA went too far, turning my farm into a runway, and I'm the U.S. transportation boss. I drove past my land today and froze. Half my corn was flattened. A strip of asphalt ran straight across my property. They had built a runway on my farm without asking. The HOA president smiled, but her eyes never did. I felt a chill, because they had no idea who I really was. And I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. I took a deep breath and prepared to show them just how much power a homeowner could really have. Welcome back to HOA Secrets Uncovered. If you love wild HOA stories and suburban chaos, you are in the right place. My name is John Miller. I live on the outskirts of a small suburban town. I run my family farm, and yes, I also happen to be the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. Some people call me calm. Some say I'm stubborn. But when the HOA crosses the line, I show them the consequences. Today, you're about to hear the story of how a simple farm became a battleground for suburban power, and how I took control. In ways they never expected, I took a deep breath and prepared to show them just how much power a homeowner could really have. The morning was quiet, too quiet. Birds chirped, but the sound didn't reach my ears. All I could see was the strip of asphalt cutting through my corn. It looked out of place, wrong, like someone had carved a scar across the earth. I parked my truck at the edge of the field and stepped out. The smell of fresh soil and corn was gone, replaced by asphalt and dust. I ran my fingers over the stalks. Crushed under machines I hadn't seen, the leaves were torn, the ground uneven. I could feel my heart pounding. Anger and disbelief fighting inside me. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a statement, a bold one, a stupid one. I walked closer to the runway. My shoes sank into the dirt at the edge, and I saw tire marks. Heavy, deep. Someone had driven machinery across my farm. Probably late at night, the HOA president, or someone working for her, had done this. I could imagine her smug smile now, thinking she had won, thinking she could control my life, my land, my farm. I wanted to shout, to yell, to demand answers, but I stopped myself. I needed calm. I needed strategy, because anger, even righteous anger, could make you a fool in front of people like them. I walked along the edge of the runway. It was straight, perfectly straight, almost cruelly precise, somewhere in the distance. The morning sun caught the asphalt and made it shine. It almost mocked me, shining under their audacity. I ran my hands through my hair and closed my eyes. I had to remember who I was. I had to remember. This wasn't just a farm anymore. This was my battlefield. The neighborhood, my quiet suburban world, was watching. Windows peeked from behind trimmed bushes. Some neighbors whispered as they passed. Some hid behind curtains, and somewhere, I knew, the HOA board was celebrating, thinking I was stunned, helpless, powerless. I laughed quietly. They had no idea. I wasn't just a farmer. I was the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, and that title, that office, gave me power over things they couldn't even imagine. Planes, roads, rules, all of it, under my control. They didn't know I could call inspectors, shut projects, or question legality. And now, they had given me a reason to do it. I knelt down, touching the edge of the asphalt. It was cold, hard, unnatural. I imagined them at the HOA office, sipping coffee, filing papers, thinking they were clever. But cleverness without caution, without respect, was dangerous. They had crossed a line that they didn't understand even existed. I looked back at my farmhouse. The windows, The white fence, the small garden, everything seemed normal from the road, but inside, I felt the tension of an impending storm. I knew this was going to be more than just a phone call or a letter. This was personal. I pulled out my phone, thinking about calling my assistant. But no, this was mine to handle first. I had to see it all, feel it, understand their audacity firsthand. So I started walking the length of the runway. Each step made a crunch under my boots. The sound echoed, like it was announcing the start of something bigger. Halfway down, I saw the markings, lines painted on the asphalt, clearly for guidance, for planes. On my farm, I stopped. I laughed again. Low, bitter. This was insane. Only in suburbia could this happen. Only in a world where petty rules and HOA power trips could escalate to this. And yet, it wasn't funny. Not really. My corn, my property, destroyed. My authority, mocked. I clenched my fists. This was not a nightmare. This was reality, twisted suburban reality. And it was absurd, cruelly absurd. I could see the edges of the runway, disappearing into my neighbors' yards. Some of them looked shocked, some curious, some guilty. I wondered who had helped them, or if they had acted alone. The mystery of the quiet, hidden neighbor crossed my mind. The one who never spoke at meetings. The one whose lawn was perfect. Who watched everything silently. Could they be behind this? Guiding it? Cheering on from the shadows? I shook my head. Too many thoughts. Too many possibilities. I had to focus. The first thing I needed was proof. Photos. Videos. Evidence for whatever legal, governmental, or bureaucratic path I would take. I pulled out my camera, snapped images of the destruction, zoomed in on tire marks, broken stalks, the painted lines, everything documented. Then I noticed something strange, a set of footprints, muddy smalls. Leading from the asphalt to the barn, they weren't mine. And they weren't recent machinery tracks. Someone had walked there. Maybe last night, maybe early morning. I followed them with my eyes, heart pounding, and then I saw it. A small paper stuck under a rock near the edge of my field. I bent down, picked it up. A note, short, typed, impersonal. Next time, follow the rules. I froze. The HOA president had warned me before, through letters, emails, phone calls. But this was bold. This was more than warning. This was a statement, a challenge, a test. I laughed again, softly this time. They had no idea what I could do, no idea what was coming. I could remove their runway. I could find them. I could expose their stupidity to the town, to the state, all of it. And I just had to plan. Carefully, I walked back to my farmhouse slowly. Eyes on the asphalt, every step. Building tension, building anticipation. Neighbors peeked through fences, dogs barked in the distance, and somewhere, the HOA president probably thought she had won. Little did she know. The game had just begun. I stepped onto my porch, looking out over the field. The runway, gleaming in the morning sun, seemed to taunt me. I felt my pulse slow down, and then speed up. I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And I knew I had to make them regret it. Without even raising my voice, I turned toward my truck, planning my next move, phone calls, letters, inspections, everything. But first, I had to understand their mind, their arrogance, their pride, their obsession with control. It fascinated me, and it angered me all at once. I leaned against my truck, looking at the horizon. The sun was higher now, but it felt like it was holding its breath too. I imagined the board meetings, the gossip, the smug looks. I imagined the reports I could send, the inspectors I could call, the fines I could issue, the headlines that could write themselves, and in that moment, I realized this was not just a fight for my farm. This was a fight for respect, for sanity, for the absurd rules that had strangled my neighborhood for too long. I smiled, quietly, because the best part was about to begin. I took one last look at the runway, the damaged corn, the note under the rock, and I whispered to myself, almost like a threat, "You don't know who you're messing with yet." And now I want to ask you, if you were in my shoes, standing in front of a runway that someone built across your farm, with a note warning you, would you play it safe, or fight back in the most shocking way possible? I stared at the runway again. The sun had climbed higher, but it did nothing to warm the anger inside me. I ran my hands over my face, thinking, planning, calculating every move. I couldn't let them get away with this. Not after the note, not after the audacity, not after my farm. My life had been mocked. I decided to drive into town. The HOA office was small, tucked between a florist and a dry cleaner. I had been there before, for routine complaints, minor disputes. But this was different. I parked across the street, watching through the window. Inside, the president and a few board members sat around a shiny oak table, coffee cups, papers, laptops. Their faces smug, smiles sharp. They didn't even glance at the window. They had no idea I was watching. I took a slow breath and walked inside. "Good morning," I said. Calm, almost too calm. They looked up, startled. The president's smile faltered. Just a little. "John?" "Hello," she said, her tone clipped. Careful. I knew she was trying to hide fear, but I could see it in her eyes. Tiny cracks. "Do you know why I'm here?" I asked. She shook her head. Slowly, I leaned on the edge of the table, letting the silence fill the room. They were expecting confrontation, yelling, a scene. Instead, I gave them nothing, just a calm stare. It unnerved them more than any shout could. "I saw the runway," I said finally, my voice low, steady, measured. The room went quiet. They looked at each other. I could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break. "I walked my land this morning," I continued, "and I found a note." I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. They leaned in, eyes wide. "Next time, follow the rules," I read aloud, letting the words linger. The president's hand twitched near her coffee cup. I placed the note on the table, slowly. Then I smiled. "Just a little. A fine gesture," I said. "But I think it's time someone explained what rules really mean." They stammered, tried to argue. "John, we were just following procedure." "Procedure?" I said, voice rising just a notch. "You flatten my corn, turn my property into a runway, and call that procedure?" The words hit the table like a hammer. I could see their smugness cracking, ever so slightly. One of the board members, a tall man with glasses, cleared his throat. Maybe we can discuss this calmly." I leaned closer. "Calmly?" I said, "You decided to cross a line, not just mine, but the laws, the rules of this country, the property rights of every neighbor who lives here." I paused, letting it sink in. "You had no idea who you were messing with." I could see panic spreading, eyes darting, hands fidgeting. The president swallowed hard, lips tight. She finally spoke, voice shaky. "John, please, we didn't mean—" I interrupted, calm again. "You didn't mean, you didn't care. And now you're going to see the consequences of that." I pulled out my phone, showed them photos, close-ups of the asphalt, broken stalks, tire marks. I showed them from different angles, zoomed in on the painted lines. They leaned forward, trying to peek. Some of them covered their mouths, some looked away, ashamed. I let them stew in it for a moment, enjoying the silence, the power shift. Then I said, almost casually, "I've already contacted inspectors, local and federal." The room froze, their jaws dropped. "You?" The president started. "Yes, me," I said, nodding slowly. "The runway, the destruction, all illegal." I let the words linger. "You've created a mess that will cost you more than you can imagine." I stood up, paced slowly around the table. The president followed my movement with her eyes. "I could issue fines, call in enforcement, revoke permits." Their faces turned pale. I stopped, leaning on the edge of the table again. "But I'm a reasonable man," I said. Pause, letting them hope for mercy. "Reasonable, if you correct your mistakes immediately." They nodded, fast, hands shaking slightly, promises spilled out. They would remove the runway. They would restore the land. They would follow my instructions. I smiled, thinly. "I will be checking," I said. "Every detail, every inch." The tension in the room was thick enough to slice with a knife. I left, slowly, letting them absorb the full weight of my words. Outside, the sun seemed brighter. The street looked peaceful. But inside, I was planning my next moves. Every board member had to understand. Power wasn't theirs to abuse, and I would make sure. They remembered it for a long time, back at my farm. I walked along the asphalt again. I touched the corn, still crushed, broken, anger mixed with amusement, the audacity, the absurdity. I laughed softly. Suburbia was full of rules, petty arguments, neighborly disputes. But this was next level. The rules had become weapons, and I was going to disarm them in style. I called my assistant, quietly. "Prepare documentation, inspections, citations, photos ready for review," I said, her voice calm but alert. "Understood, sir," she said. I hung up, feeling the rush of control, of strategy, of power. I sat on the porch, staring at the runway. Neighbors walked by, trying not to stare. Dogs barked in yards. Children played. Life went on. Unaware of the storm building quietly, I smiled again. The HOA had tried to intimidate me. They had tried to test me, and they had no idea how dangerous compliance could be. I imagined the board meeting, their whispers, the gossip spreading. I imagined the panic when inspectors arrived, the phone calls they couldn't answer, the letters they would receive, all of it. A slow, delicious unraveling, and I couldn't wait to watch it happen. But even as I planned, part of me wondered, how far would they go before they realized they had underestimated me? Would they fight back? Would they try more tricks, more schemes, more audacity? Or would they crumble under the weight of their own arrogance? I took a deep breath. Looking at the horizon, the runway stretched across my farm. Absurd, mocking, daring. I knew one thing for certain. This fight was only beginning, and the best part would be seeing them try to fix it. Without losing face, I looked at the note again. Next time, follow the rules. I smiled, quietly. Next time? This time, I would show them what it really means to follow rules, and how devastating it can be when someone who knows the system decides to play by them perfectly. And now I want to ask you, if you were standing on your property, watching someone destroy your farm for a petty rule, and you had all the power to fight back quietly but ruthlessly, would you strike immediately or plan the perfect revenge and watch them squirm? The morning sun hit the runway again, and I felt a strange mix of anger and amusement. It gleamed in the light, a straight scar across my farm. Neighbors walked past, pretending not to stare, but I could feel their eyes. I walked slowly along the edge of the asphalt, boots crunching over dirt and broken corn. Every step reminded me of their arrogance, their stupidity, their petty sense of power. I pulled my phone out, checking messages from my assistant, updates from inspectors, documentation of every mark on the runway, photos ready for review. I smiled, quietly. The HOA had no idea how thoroughly I planned, how quietly I could dismantle their little empire. They thought this was about me reacting, about confrontation. They didn't know it was about patience, about control, and control. I had in abundance. I went to my barn, the place where I kept old farm equipment and files, and sat down. I spread the photos across the table, close-ups of tire tracks, edges of asphalt, the broken corn stalks pressed into the dirt, notes, letters, and HOA memos stacked neatly. It looked chaotic, but it wasn't. Every detail mattered. Every small piece of evidence was a weapon, and soon they would see just how sharp those weapons could be. I remembered the note. Next time, follow the rules. I laughed softly. Next time? There would be no next time for them. Not if I could help it. I decided I needed to escalate. But subtly, the HOA needed to understand. This was not a game. This was a lesson. Disguised as compliance, I drove into town again, to the local supply store. Pretending to browse, I watched the HOA president leave the office, hurried, tense. She didn't see me. She didn't notice the way I followed at a distance, quietly, patiently. She thought she was safe. She was about to learn. Safety was an illusion that evening. I returned to my farm. The runway gleamed in the fading light. I walked along it, listening to the wind rustle through the remaining corn. The destruction was almost artistic, cruelly precise. I imagined them sitting in their offices, smiling, thinking they had won, and I smiled back. Silently plotting. Power wasn't in destruction. It was in patience. In the perfect application of rules and consequences, I decided to write them a letter. Carefully, calmly, as though nothing had happened. I wanted them to feel safe, to think they had a chance. I wrote about inspections, compliance, and legality. Every word precise. I mentioned restoration, fines, penalties, all in polite tones. I mailed it to their office, watching the mailman leave. It was slow, methodical, and absolutely devastating. The next day, I walked my land again, boots crunching, hands in pockets. Neighbors waved cautiously, avoiding eye contact with the looming runway. Some whispered, trying to guess what I would do. I let them wonder. Uncertainty, fear, curiosity. It was all part of the plan. The HOA had underestimated me, and that was their greatest mistake. I began thinking about meetings, board gatherings, the smug arrogance of their little club. They believed they could intimidate everyone, enforce petty rules, control lawns and mailboxes like kings and queens. But they had never dealt with someone who could enforce rules at their own level, someone who knew the system inside out, someone who could bend it without breaking a sweat. I leaned against my truck, staring at the asphalt. This was about justice, but also irony. They had created their own downfall with paint, asphalt, and arrogance. I knew I needed witnesses, neighbors who had been quietly watching. I called a few, casually, asking if they had noticed the destruction. Some hesitated, afraid of HOA retaliation. I reassured them, quietly. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is people, watching, waiting, recording. I made mental notes. Who could testify? Who could give accounts? Every small detail counted. That evening, I walked to the edge of the runway again. The air was cool. The corn smelled faintly of earth and dust. I looked down at the ground, imagining inspectors measuring, documenting, calculating fines. I could almost hear the panic in their office. Voices raised, papers shuffled, excuses prepared. The thought made me grin. Power, subtle, precise. More satisfying than anger or revenge. I thought about the next move. Carefully. I could call inspections directly. I could send letters threatening compliance violations. But I wanted to stretch it, savor it, let them feel the tension, patience, like seasoning. Made the final strike even more delicious. I imagined the president pacing, wondering what was coming. Every step she took, closer to panic. Closer to understanding she had no control. I spent the night reviewing every HOA rule, every local ordinance, every possible legal loophole. I highlighted the ones they had broken, exaggerated slightly for effect. By morning, I had a plan. It wasn't fast, it wasn't messy, it was elegant. And that elegance, that quiet precision, would crush their confidence more than shouting or anger could. The following morning, I walked along the runway again, documenting, taking notes, imagining. Every detail mattered. The cracks in the asphalt, the edges, the painted lines. I imagined inspectors arriving, measuring, photographing, documenting. The HOA president would watch helplessly, her smug smile. Gone. Her arrogance. Crushed by reality, I paused, thinking. I could involve the neighbors subtly, let them see the truth. The audacity of the board, fear and awe, mixed perfectly. I smiled. They thought power came from rules, but sometimes power comes from knowing the rules and using them quietly, devastatingly. I stopped at the edge of the asphalt. Touching the cold surface, I imagined the board scrambling. The letters, fines, inspection, was piling up. I could almost hear their whispers, their excuses, their panic, the irony. Delicious. They had tried to control me. And in doing so, they had trapped themselves. I leaned back, watching the sun rise higher. Everything seemed peaceful. The corn swayed faintly. Birds chirped cautiously. Neighbors peeked through fences, wondering what would happen. And somewhere, the HOA president was already imagining the worst. I took a deep breath, looking across my farm, across the absurd, gleaming runway. It was still here, still mocking me. But I was ready. I had patience, power, witnesses, and rules on my side. They had arrogance, ignorance, and asphalt. And now I ask you, if you found someone destroying your property, bending rules to intimidate you, and you had all the tools to fight back quietly, slowly, perfectly, would you act immediately, or savor the suspense and plan the perfect strike? The morning light hit the runway again, and it felt different this time. Not just a scar across my farm, but a challenge, a silent dare. I walked along the edge, boots crunching, heart steady, mind racing. Every detail mattered. Every inch of asphalt was a reminder of their arrogance. I could almost hear them laughing in their offices. Smug, confident, thinking I'd panic. Little did they know. Patience is the deadliest weapon. I spent the morning taking measurements, photographing every corner of the runway, close-ups of tire tracks, broken corn, paint lines. Even tiny imperfections became evidence. I wanted proof. Solid, undeniable, perfect. This wasn't just about retaliation. It was about teaching a lesson in humility, in respect, in consequences. The neighbors were out, tending their lawns, walking dogs. Some glanced at me curiously, others cautiously. I waved to a few. Quietly, I wanted them to know I was calm, that I was in control. Confidence is contagious, and fear spreads faster than anger. I thought about the HOA president, her sharp smile, her cold eyes. I imagined her pacing in her office, reading my letters, seeing the photos, wondering what my next move would be. She didn't know. I had no intention of confronting them loudly, no shouting, no screaming, just the slow, deliberate unraveling of their plans. Like watching a line of dominoes fall one by one, I decided to make a visit to the town clerk. Casually, pretend it was an innocent inquiry. Maybe about permits, property lines, nothing alarming. But in truth, I was planting seeds, letting the system notice the irregularities, the small cracks in the HOA's authority. Each clerk I spoke to, carefully informed, subtly warned. Nothing illegal, nothing confrontational, just facts. And facts are powerful. I returned to my farm just as the sun began to dip. The asphalt seemed to glimmer mockingly in the golden light. I ran my hands over the crushed corn. A ritual now. It reminded me of the audacity of the HOA, their sense of control, their overreach, their ignorance. I decided it was time for psychological warfare, the kind that leaves scars without a fight. I wrote another letter, this time precise, polite. Threatening only with the calmest tone, I described inspections, fines, restoration plans. Every word was measured, every sentence deliberate. I mailed it and walked back to the farm, imagining the reaction. I could almost see the president's fingers tremble as she read it, the subtle panic beginning to creep in. Later that evening, I noticed movement on the other side of the runway. A neighbor, or maybe an HOA member, trying to sneak a peek perhaps. Curiosity and fear mixed in their steps. I didn't move. I just watched, quietly. Sometimes, being seen without acknowledging it is enough to unsettle people, and I could feel the tension thickening. Little whispers of control, of power, of oversight, the kind that makes arrogant people question themselves. And I could feel it working already. I thought about the psychological toll on the president, the tension she must feel, trying to maintain authority over neighbors who quietly feared her. But now, the tension would shift. Slowly, methodically, she would feel the pressure, the weight of scrutiny, the inevitability of accountability. And the more she tried to regain control, the deeper she would sink into panic. I walked to the barn and looked at the equipment, tractors, plows, old tools, all mundane. Yet in my hands, all potential. I could document, report, threaten, enforce, quietly, legally, perfectly. They had made a mistake thinking size and title meant control, rules, documentation, patience, strategy. Those were my weapons now. As night fell, I sat on the porch again, staring at the dark runway. The shadows stretched long across the corn. It looked almost alive, a symbol of arrogance and audacity. And I realized every rule they had broken, every petty violation they had ignored, every act of arrogance was now mine to exploit. And I would, silently, patiently, perfectly. And now I have to ask you, if someone destroyed your property, broke every rule and thought they could intimidate you, would you strike immediately? Or plan a slow, perfect, unstoppable comeback that leaves them questioning everything they thought they knew? The next morning, the runway gleamed under the sun like a warning. A straight, cold line of asphalt cutting through my farm. I walked along it slowly, boots crunching over dirt and crushed corn. The air was quiet, too quiet. Neighbors whispered behind fences, peeking through trimmed bushes. I could feel their curiosity, their fear, the subtle tension in their eyes. It was delicious. I smiled quietly. Patience was everything. The HOA, the thought this was about power, about rules, about intimidation. They had no idea it was about control, about strategy, about letting them twist themselves into knots without lifting a finger. I pulled out my camera, snapping photos of every detail, the edges of the asphalt, the tire marks, the broken corn. Even tiny cracks in the paint lines were evidence. I documented everything meticulously, because one day, these small details would become their downfall. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slowly. One of my neighbors, old Mr. Jenkins, was watching quietly from the edge of his property. He raised a hand in greeting, hesitated, then lowered it. I waved back. No words exchanged. Just a silent understanding. He had seen what the HOA had done, and he, like me, had questions about how far their arrogance could go. I walked back to the farmhouse thinking, the HOA president. She was probably pacing in her office right now, wondering how I had reacted, wondering if I would scream, yell, or make a scene. She had no idea. My game didn't require yelling. It required patience, precision, and a subtle, growing pressure that would make her crack without a fight. I decided it was time for the first small strike, a passive-aggressive maneuver. I sent a letter to the HOA, polite, calm, carefully worded. I outlined every violation, every illegal act, every absurd step they had taken. I mentioned inspections, fines, and restoration plans. Nothing confrontational, nothing dramatic, just the facts, legal, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The letter was delivered in the afternoon. I imagined her reading it, coffee in hand, fingers trembling slightly, the precision of the language, the subtle threat behind every sentence. The realization that they had underestimated me. I could almost see her trying to maintain composure, failing quietly inside. That evening, I walked the length of the Runway again. The corn swayed in the wind, broken but resilient. The asphalt gleamed under the fading sunlight, mocking, daring, challenging. I ran my hands over the edge, feeling the cold, hard surface. This wasn't just a strip of asphalt anymore. It was a symbol of the HOA's arrogance, their audacity, and soon, their downfall. I began to think about compliance and rules in a different way. The HOA prided itself on enforcing petty regulations, mailbox heights, lawn colors, fence styles. Now those same rules could be used against them. I could highlight their own obsession with order, turn it into their undoing. Every small infraction, every overlooked law, every technicality could become my weapon. I spent the night planning quietly. I wrote notes, drafted letters, imagined scenarios, each possibility tested in my mind. What if they ignored the letter? What if they tried to retaliate? I knew exactly how I would respond. With calm precision, patience, and absolute control. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the asphalt again. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny footprints, almost invisible, leading toward the barn. Someone had been there, quietly. I couldn't tell if it was a neighbor, a board member, or just an animal. But the presence reminded me of the HOA's paranoia. They had no idea I was watching, planning, waiting. I smiled quietly. Paranoia is a powerful tool. I would let them stew in it. Let them imagine threats, consequences, repercussions, every sleepless night, every worry, every whispered conversation among neighbors. All of it would work in my favor. I spent the afternoon arranging the next stage. I called inspectors discreetly, asked for measurements, reviews, and reports. I wanted the HOA to feel the slow pressure, not a storm, not a confrontation, just the quiet certainty that their missteps had consequences. I walked to the barn in the evening. The shadows stretched long across the corn. The asphalt seemed alive, almost taunting me. I leaned against the wooden post and smiled. The subtle tension building in the HOA office, the quiet unease spreading among neighbors. All of it was beautiful in its simplicity. I thought about the psychological warfare. They had tried to intimidate me with destruction. I would return the favor, quietly, patiently, irreversibly. Rules, compliance, inspections, documentation, every small act carefully planned to leave them questioning everything they thought they knew, their confidence. Crumbling slowly, perfectly, I walked to the edge of the runway and touched the asphalt again, cold, hard, unyielding, like the arrogance it represented. I imagined the president reading my letters, the tiny cracks forming in her carefully constructed persona, the tension she would feel, knowing that every move she made could be documented, challenged, scrutinized, every little mistake. Now a weapon. The irony was perfect. I thought about neighbors again, who had witnessed, who had whispered, who had feared. I would let them see the truth, let them observe the unraveling quietly. Fear and curiosity, mixed perfectly. Power, after all, is often invisible until it strikes, and when it does, it leaves lasting impressions. Night fell, and I sat on the porch. The asphalt reflected the pale moonlight, the runway, still mocking, still daring. I could feel the anticipation building. The HOA had underestimated me. They didn't know patience was a weapon. They didn't know rules could be used as a hammer. They didn't know subtlety could destroy arrogance. And now I want to ask you, if someone tried to intimidate you, break your property, bend the rules against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you plan a quiet, unstoppable strategy that slowly makes them crumble without lifting a finger? The morning air felt heavier than usual. The runway glimmered in the sun, every inch of it a reminder of the board's audacity and their impending reckoning. I walked along the edge slowly, boots crunching over broken corn and asphalt debris. Neighbors peeked from behind fences, whispering quietly. I caught snippets, speculation, fear, awe. It was perfect. The tension was palpable, thick enough to taste. I stopped mid-step and pulled out my phone. Messages from inspectors, emails confirming appointments, photos cataloged meticulously. Everything ready, everything in order. I smiled. Quietly, patiently. The HOA thought they had control, thought they had intimidated me. They had no idea the storm was already quietly gathering, ready to strike. I decided to visit their office again. Not to confront, not to yell, just to observe. I parked down the street, watching through the window, inside. The president was talking nervously to her board, eyes darting, hands fidgeting, papers shuffled like frantic birds trying to escape. She didn't see me. She didn't even know the weight of the evidence I carried, the slow building pressure she could no longer control. I walked inside casually. "Good morning," I said, calm, deliberate. They looked up, startled. The president's smile was gone, replaced by tension. "John," she started, voice shaky. I let silence stretch between us. Nothing dramatic, just stillness. Sometimes stillness is louder than anger. And in that silence I could see their panic starting to bloom. "I've been reviewing the runway," I said softly. "They've documented everything. Photos, measurements, tire tracks, broken corn. Every detail. I let them process the words, let the realization sink in. They didn't know how deeply I had prepared, how methodically I had documented, how unstoppable I could be." One board member tried to speak. "John, surely we can." I cut him off. "Surely you can what?" I said calmly. "Undo what you've done, repair what you've destroyed, pretend this never happened?" Their faces fell, pale and helpless. I leaned against the table, letting the silence do its work. "I've already contacted inspectors," I continued, soft but sharp. "They'll arrive today. Check measurements, compliance, legality." I watched the color drain from their faces. The president's hands shook as she reached for a pen. She wanted to defend herself, wanted to negotiate, but she couldn't. I had already trapped her in a web of rules, patience, and evidence. I left, slowly letting the tension follow me. Outside, the sun hit my farm. The runway gleaming in golden light. I walked its length once more, documenting, imagining inspectors measuring, photographing, calculating fines. I could almost hear the panic building in the HOA office. Every step they took, every decision, watched quietly by me, by the law, by fate. The irony was delicious. That afternoon, the inspectors arrived. They measured carefully, photographed every inch, every crack, every tire mark, every painted line, documented meticulously. I watched from a distance, calm as a cat. The HOA president arrived, trying to assert authority. Her steps were quick, nervous. She spoke to the inspectors, quietly, politely, but the tension was visible. Her smirk, gone. Her arrogance. Crumbling, I approached slowly. "Morning," I said. The inspectors acknowledged me politely, then turned back to work. I didn't need to say more. The weight of control, the slow building pressure. It was already working, the president muttered under her breath. Fidgeting, her hands trembling slightly. She realized. This was beyond her petty rules, beyond her office, beyond her arrogance, the evidence, the law, the careful planning. Unstoppable. I walked along the edge of the runway again. Neighbors peeked from windows, whispered behind fences. Some smiled quietly. Some shook their heads in disbelief. The subtle tension, the fear, the anticipation, all building. I could almost see the dominoes ready to fall. And when they did, the HOA would have no choice but to face the consequences. The inspectors finished, filed reports, nodded politely. I shook hands quietly. No drama, no yelling, just a calm, patient smile. I walked back across my property, imagining the chaos slowly unfolding in the HOA office. Letters being drafted, excuses being prepared, whispers spreading among board members, every small move. Trapped, documented, impossible to deny. I sat on the porch that evening, staring at the runway. The sun set, casting long shadows across the corn and asphalt. The weight of justice, of patience, of careful planning. Settled over the farm like a quiet storm, I smiled softly. They had thought this was about power. They had no idea it was about patience. Control, subtle precision. A board had played with fire, and now, without knowing it, they were standing in the flames. I thought about the psychological impact on the president. Every decision she had made, questioned now. Every minor infraction, magnified. The arrogance that once gave her confidence, now crumbling under careful scrutiny. Power shifts quietly, imperceptibly, until one day, it's undeniable. And today, it was undeniable. Neighbors walked by, curious, cautious. They asked quietly about the inspectors, about the letters. I smiled, calm, collected, no need to boast, no need to shout, patience, strategy, evidence. Those were enough. I could see the fear and respect growing, the perfect mix. I walked the runway once more, boots crunching softly. The corn swayed faintly, whispering with the wind. The asphalt gleamed under the fading sun. I imagined letters being sent, fines calculated, compliance enforced. The HOA president, pacing nervously, realizing for the first time she had no control. And now, I ask you, if someone destroyed your property, broke every rule, abused power, and you had every piece of evidence and every right on your side, would you confront them with immediate fury? Or would you patiently let the system, the law, and your planning quietly dismantle their arrogance? The morning was quiet, almost too quiet. The sun rose slowly over my farm, casting long shadows across the runway. I walked along its edge, boots crunching broken corn and dirt. Every step felt heavy, full of anticipation. Today, everything would change. I had waited patiently, planned meticulously, documented every detail. The HOA had underestimated me at every turn. They had thought arrogance and petty rules could intimidate a U.S. transportation secretary. and a farmer at the same time. They were wrong, so very, very wrong. I checked my phone. Messages from inspectors confirmed, reports filed, photos review. Ed, citations calculated, everything legal, everything undeniable. Every inch of asphalt, every crushed corn stalk, a piece of evidence, and now the weight of accountability was falling. I drove slowly into the neighborhood, past houses with perfectly trimmed lawns, mailboxes standing at exact heights, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some waving quietly. I waved back, calm, collected. They had been watching, waiting, curious, and now they would see justice. Quietly, undeniably delivered. I parked near the HOA office. Inside, chaos reigned quietly. The president and board members huddled over letters and reports. Whispers, frantic gestures, papers shuffled like leaves in a storm. Their arrogance completely gone. The smirk that once haunted the cul-de-sac vanished. I walked in calmly. "Good morning," I said softly. They looked up, pale, nervous, eyes wide. The president opened her mouth, then closed it. Words failed her. She realized immediately. This was not a negotiation. This was the consequences of every reckless decision she had made. "I see the inspectors have been thorough," I said, my tone polite, almost casual. "But thorough enough," I continued, "to document every violation, every illegal step, every act of arrogance on this property." I placed the reports on the table, photos, measurements, citations, evidence meticulously compiled. The room went silent. No arguing, no excuses, nothing to hide behind. I leaned against the table. Quietly. "The runway," I said softly, "was a bold move. But boldness without knowledge, without understanding, without respect, is dangerous." Their faces fell further. The tension was perfect, silent, crushing. I glanced around the room. Each board member shifted nervously, eyes darted, hands trembled. The president tried to regain composure, but it was gone. The weight of their decisions, the arrogance, the absurdity, finally hitting home. Every petty rule they had enforced, every threat they had made, backfired, and they had no idea how far their own compliance obsession could be used against them. I walked out slowly. Outside, neighbors had gathered quietly, curious, cautious, watching. I could see awe and relief in their eyes. Some whispered about the inspections, the reports, the patience, the quiet justice. They had seen power wielded without shouting, control applied without rage, and they understood it. Back at my farm, I walked the length of the runway again, boots crunching softly, hands in pockets. The asphalt glimmered in the sunlight, almost smugly, but I smiled quietly. It was no longer a symbol of destruction or audacity. It was a monument to patience, strategy, and inevitability. The HOA had tried to intimidate me, and they had been dismantled by their own rules, their own arrogance, their own carelessness. I called my assistant. "Ensure all documentation is filed. Copies sent to the local authorities, neighbors informed." Her calm voice responded, "Understood, sir." I hung up. The dominoes were falling perfectly. The HOA would face consequences. Quietly, legally, and unmistakably, I thought about the president, her power, reduced to whispers, papers, panic, her arrogance. Crushed by meticulous planning, she had no idea how compliance, patience, and strategy could destroy arrogance without a single confrontation. And now, she would learn the lesson of a lifetime. Evening fell, and I stood on the porch. The corn swayed softly, the runway gleamed under the fading light. Neighbors walked quietly past, some waved, some shook their heads in disbelief. And somewhere, The HOA president was pacing in her office, imagining every fine, every citation, every detail being enforced. The irony was perfect, the absurdity delicious. I thought about the psychology of it all. They had tried to control the neighborhood with petty rules and threats. I had used those same rules, their obsession, their arrogance. Against them, patience, documentation, subtle pressure. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it creeps quietly, but it is always inevitable. I walked the runway one last time, touching the cold asphalt, feeling the crushed corn beneath my boots. I smiled quietly. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. It was irony. It was proof that control, patience, and strategy always outweigh arrogance, intimidation, and carelessness. The neighbors began to talk quietly among themselves, some admiring the quiet victory, some laughing softly at the absurdity, all of them aware that the HOA had overstepped and had been taken down quietly, perfectly, inevitably. And I watched, calm, collected, victorious. I thought about the president again, how she would explain this to her board, her neighbors, herself, the letters, the citations, the inspections. Her arrogance had crumbled under careful planning, calm patience, and meticulous strategy, and there was nothing she could do. I sat on the porch, staring at the sunset over my farm, the runway, the symbol of arrogance. Glimmering softly in the fading light, I could almost hear the whispers, the panic, the awe, the respect, the perfect, quiet culmination of strategy and patience. And now, I want to ask you, if someone tried to destroy your property, bend rules, and intimidate you, and you had all the tools to fight back quietly, legally, and perfectly, would you confront them immediately, or would you plan the slowest, most satisfying dismantling of their arrogance, letting every step crumble under its own weight? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious to know, would you strike fast, or let justice creep quietly, perfectly, inevitably?